Thank you.
Sarah Hudson, everybody.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you haven't noticed already, I'm kind of sick. So if you don't understand something I say, just stop me. I'm not going to be offended. Okay? And secondly, if I just blank out and stare at you, that's why. just bear with me. We're going to get through this, y'all. The reason I came out, even as sick as I am, is because this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. When I began as a junior developer, there weren't any resources. I didn't have any mentors. I had nobody to talk to about how to, navigate a project, how to navigate sticky conversations. And I had a lot of really terrible conversations with clients, a lot of failures along the way, and I learned through the school of hard knocks. So I'm hoping that by bringing those failures to you, you can learn from that and know not to do the same things. So let's get started. A little bit about me first. I'm a senior UI developer and a team lead at Cardinal Solutions. So somehow, despite all the failures, I clawed my way up. You can too, for sure. My background is, in the beginning, physical product development. So I did a lot of branding work and web design and development for retail products. And graphic web design, web development, app development over the last few years. So I have 8 years of experience in coding and 6 professional. The first thing I want to talk to you about before we really delve into the whole shebang, if you will, is Agile and common Agile practices. A disclaimer, this is for informational purposes only. I'm not certified in any way, so take it with a grain of salt. This is just things that I've noticed while working across the board, various teams, and I believe around 9 companies by now. So who here has heard of Agile? Okay, pretty much everybody. Who here has been on a team that utilizes Agile? Okay, so a quick overview of what Agile and Scrum are. Agile is a methodology, right? So it's a time-boxed, iterative approach to software delivery, and it's about building software incrementally from the start of the project instead of having the project delivered at the end. So you're basically splitting it up into 2-week sprints or 3-week. It really depends on the team. And at the end of that sprint, you should have a full functioning feature or project, something that a user can use to accomplish a goal. And that allows us to do more of like a continuous delivery type thing and to keep things moving. Kind of like Facebook, I believe it was like, fail fast and often or something like that. I can't quite remember verbatim, but that's the basic idea. Scrum is not the same as Agile. It is more of a framework of Agile. So it's a subset, and it includes further specifications for how to run a team. And that includes the sprint ceremonies, which we'll get into in a minute, self-organizing teams. So if one person is gone from the team, somebody else steps up to fill their place. So there's no gaps. And then Scrum artifacts, which we'll also get into in a minute. So some terminology you might hear around Agile projects. MVP, it stands for minimum viable product. And it is the most pared down set of features that can be released as a full functioning app. This is different from what you get at the end of each sprint because this is what you'll get more like at the end of a phase 1. So it would be like the first version of a product, essentially. A sprint, as we kind of talked about before, is that agreed upon unit of time for releasing the full functioning features of an application. Your sprints are going to repeat until the project is deemed completed by the powers that may be. Scrum event or a ceremony. This is really just a fancy word for a meeting. And they repeat each sprint at certain times during that sprint to clarify, what the team is working on and expectations. And I believe we're going to break that down in another slide. Scrum artifacts, these are thought of as info repositories. So they're just ways for your team to keep track of information that they'll need, including like a backlog of tasks or tickets. And these tasks and tickets may not be in your current sprint. but it's just so you don't forget about it when you finish that sprint and move on to the next one. The Scrum team is going to consist of a few key players. First of all, we have our product owner, and this is the head honcho, right? So he signs off on priorities and validates work. The Scrum master, he's not really a boss in this, more just he runs the ceremonies and ensures the team has what they need. So if you're missing information or you have some technology need, maybe you need to get through security, you need access to something, then the Scrum Master is there to facilitate that so that you don't have to waste time solving that yourself. You can focus more on development. And then finally, the development team is going to be designers and developers. They're anybody who's actually doing the work on the project and moving it forward. I believe the teams will probably be around typically 7 to 9 people. So some more terminology. Validation. What do I mean when I say validation? Well, when the product owner signs off on business requirements being met, he's said to have validated the task or the story. He says this is completed as I expected it to be completed. The user story is a high-level definition of a requirement. It's going to be just enough to give developers the ability to make estimations. So it could be something like, as a user, I expect to be able to log into the app. That would be an example of like a high-level user story. And from there, you can kind of break it down into subtasks, like what does that mean? An epic, it can be thought of as a large chunk of work. So it's a large user story, and you can break that down into smaller stories. Definition of done. This is driving your quality of work, and it's used to assess when a user story has been completed. And this isn't saying, when I log in and it fails and I expect an error to pop up. It's going to be more across the board. So have you completed unit tests? Have you validated with the product owner? Did the designer sign off on it? Have you written proper documentation for it? Those would all be factored into a definition of done. Acceptance criteria is more like story-specific requirements. So that would be if you logged in and it failed, the error message would show. That would be a piece of acceptance criteria for that story. Then you have blockers. Those are sometimes called impediments. And this is any limitation or need that is blocking you from completing your story. So this could be something you need from another person, like you need to design. Maybe you are missing some acceptance criteria. Maybe you have that technology limitation with needing security to open up a port or something so you could get access to an API, things like that. It could be a skill gap, like you have never worked with this framework before and you're blocked from completing the story because you need somebody more senior to kind of walk you through it. It could be missing info that you need to research. It could be any of these things, but whenever you face a blocker or impediment, it's crucial that you bring it up so that everybody is aware. So speaking of ceremonies, these are those fancy words for meetings, right? Because we like to be fancy. We have the planning meeting, and this is the first one in a sprint. So it's conducted at the beginning of each sprint. And it's used to determine your goals and to prioritize your backlog. So what will happen is the product owner will come in, look at the backlog and say, during the sprint, I want the team to work on this set of tasks and pull that into the sprint and start the sprint. The team will then estimate how hard it will be to complete these tasks and how much time it will take. And then it's kind of split up among the team members. Then you have stand-ups, and these are, they occur every day, and they're going to be at most 15 minutes, and it's a daily review of just 3 things. So what user stories you completed or worked on yesterday, what user stories you will work on today, and then any blockers or impediments you have. If it runs more than 15 minutes, then you need to sidebar it. And that just means that you need to take it outside of the meeting. You don't want to hold people hostages in meetings. Nobody likes that. Then at the end of the sprint, you are going to have 2 ceremonies. The first one is going to be your sprint review or demo. And that's the meeting where you are in a room with the stakeholders of the project owner and the whole development team. and you give a demonstration of the full functioning feature to the stakeholders. So they see that progress has been made and they're happy that things are moving forward. After that review, the stakeholders will leave the room and you'll just be left with your core team of just the Scrum Master, product owner, and your development team. And you'll conduct what's called a retro. And here it's about raising any issues you face during the sprint, like, what went wrong? What can we do better? How can we improve? What went well? What do we want to keep doing? That sort of thing. So if anything went wrong, it's in everybody's best interest to speak up because nobody's going to be thrown under the bus, right? This is more about airing your dirty laundry. Everybody wants the team to succeed and the project to succeed. So we're all kind of on the same page here. So that being said, let's get into the nitty-gritty of kind of kicking off your new project. Before we get into any stories, I want to talk about what a typical development life cycle looks like, because there's going to be cases where it doesn't look like this, and you want to be able to identify what the missing pieces are, right? So in a typical development life cycle, you have a couple of core things. You want it to be iterative, and that's where Agile comes in. So this life cycle should take place over each feature or each user story that you work on. And it's not always going to be in sequence. So it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4. A lot of these will happen in tandem. So you'll have design and development happening at the same time in a sprint, maybe on different things. But there should be a time where the designer and developer sit down, go over the prototype, and come up with a plan for moving that forward. You really, when you're working with designers, you want to push for them to actually take the time to sit down with you and go over interaction design, like how should this UI element behave when I click on it? What happens if it's incorrect? Like how should it validate? That type of thing. That tends to get lost a lot of times in static prototypes. So don't let them just throw it over the fence. Go talk to them. A lot of times this development lifecycle can also look like, you start off with a meeting, and in this meeting you are discussing the stories and you're whiteboarding it out with your team. The client may be present there too. And from there, once you say, okay, I like the direction this concept is going in, you take it and your designer will create high fidelity mock-ups. And this means something like a Photoshop mock-up where it looks close to what it would on the web, right? And you would take that and create the HTML prototype from that. And this wouldn't have any like JavaScript functionality or backend or anything like that. It's just going to be static HTML and CSS so that people can be able to walk through the flow and kind of understand the UX of it. And from there, you would then fill in those missing details, the database tables, any APIs, backend functionality, your JavaScript framework to kind of hook it all in, and then you would go to the working application. That being said, let's talk about what I did wrong on my first large project. So the story goes, I had been working as a designer and a developer for about a year. And I had been working for smaller companies at that point, and that was I believe it was my third company. I was working in product development, and we had partnered with one of the major hospitals in the area. I'm not going to name names, but there's one or two, so you have 50-50 chance of being right. Well, one day our department had told the design team, hey, so we've been tasked to build a basically like a marketing site for the hospital and for our company, like our collaboration. So it was a big deal, right? Well, we get the basic information from him, basically just what he tells us about the project. And then the three of us, because there were three of us on the team, what did we do? We split up. We isolated ourselves. We went back to our cube, and we're just like, yeah, we're going to get all heads down and just, we're going to crank it out, going to get 3 mock-ups out. It's going to be great. It wasn't, right? There was we were competing against each other, right? We're like, I'm going to win this project. I'm going to win, We weren't talking. We weren't asking questions. We weren't We weren't even talking to our department head. So the day of the meeting comes, and we're shuffled into a room with the vice president of the company, with representatives from the hospital, our department head, and of course, the three of us. And we go through our presentation. We present our mock-ups. They were kind of confused. There was a lot of questions going on, about why did you leave this out of the navigation, and how's the user going to find this bit of information, and what's that color? Because it's always about color, right? Everybody gets so turned about color. So after the meeting, the department head pulls the three of us aside and is just like, what was that? You didn't even use their brand book. You didn't even ask for it, Those weren't their colors at all. You didn't even do the bare minimum. You didn't find out, what is the user trying to do? You didn't find out even who the target audience is. That was completely just off base. Really just raking us over the coals. And it was just a really sobering moment for us, right? Because we felt so good about this. This is my best work yet. I'm gonna win this client. But no, the problem we faced was not only did we isolate ourselves and not communicate, we also skipped steps of this life cycle, right? We should have spent more time in analysis and planning, but instead we jumped straight into design and development. No planning at all. So that kind of leads us into the next line. Before prototyping, here's what you do. So you don't end up like me, raked over the rails and embarrassed and shamed. The first thing you want to do is define your purpose of the project. What are the problems the client is facing currently? What problems do they want to solve, right? Prioritize. What issues are the most crucial to solve? We don't want to be chasing small, petty things, trying to get this micro interaction just right on the screen. User probably doesn't care. And then what belongs on the MVP and what belongs on the wish list. And this is something clients do struggle with. It doesn't make them a bad client to be pushing for something on the wish list. They don't understand that it's a wish list item. That's our job, right? We take them by the hand and we lead them to their goal because they don't know. They know less than anybody. And timeline. We want to make sure we agree on a timeline from the get-go. So how many features in MVP can you realistically get done? And when you're thinking through timeline, you want to consider all the aspects of it. You want to consider your testing. That includes writing unit tests. That includes QA, quality assurance. It includes time refactoring. So, I always say done is better than good, but you always want to go back and try to clean that up so the next, poor sap behind you doesn't say, I don't understand what's going on. And then bug fixes, make time for that because it will happen. It doesn't matter how much experience you will have a ton of bug fixes. Even ones that you didn't think were bugs. You're like, that's a feature though. And also consider your skill level and how much experience you have in the technology you're coding for. Then expectations. I would say this is the most important thing, is to make sure you set expectations up front. For example, how often will you demo and who is in charge of the project? Who will interface with the client? What is your role and what kind of work will you be delivering? It's really bad if you go onto a project thinking, I'm going to just be doing the HTML and CSS, but they actually want you to do the APIs. Yeah, make sure you clear that up right away. And then about under-promising and over-delivering, this is kind of a typical thing we tell people, right? So you want to build trust, at least in the beginning, by being conservative in your estimations. You don't want to get stuck in a situation where you say, oh yeah, we could do that 3 days, right? No problem. And then, bam, you hit a wall. That sucks. You also want to identify the key players. So who's in charge of the decisions, right? This isn't always apparent. And you can't just go up to a client and be like, hey, so are you in charge, or is it that guy? Is that guy your boss? And then the lady's like, hey, I'm the boss. Awkward situation, right? So the first thing you want to do when you're meeting with your client is kind of read the room, right? Read facial expressions, read body language, see who takes charge of the room. If you're still not really sure, then it's probably okay to go talk to a peer about, be like, hey, who is validating the stories? That's kind of like a sugar-coated way of being like, who's the boss, right? And then rapport, building rapport with your client. This is often very overlooked, but the basic idea is don't eschew small talk, right? It might seem trivial, like, oh, hey, like, why do I need to do that? I could just, go code right now. No, people is like half the work, unfortunately. I know we went into this to get away from people, but you're still going to have to talk to them. Yeah. So that means, asking questions like, how did your day go? Like, how is your daughter doing? Did she do well in finals? Like, oh, the weather we're having. Things that might seem insignificant. That really makes them see you as a human being, right? And then they'll have more empathy for you when you screw up. They're like, oh, yeah, that's my friend, So I try to make friends with my clients a little bit, and, that builds some more trust there. It's all about building that trust and keeping the feelings good. And then familiarizing yourself with the tech stack. That's pretty self-explanatory, but really when you first start a new project, if it's an existing one, you want to read any documentation they have. Read the unit tests. That will tell you the intent of your features, more so than reading the source code straight up. And then the tech stack is going to really impact your choices moving forward, right, in your architecture. So that's why it's kind of important to get your feet wet with it. If you don't have any documentation, unit tests, any sort of thing to go off of, what I would suggest doing is go ahead and dig in the source code. It's going to be painful, but just keep a running list of questions about the code as you're looking through it. If you're doing it from scratch, congratulations, you're lucky. So I'm going to kind of just skim through these because this was the biggest time suck when I was going through my presentation, but I'll send this out at the end so you'll have these common lists of questions, and I'll just kind of cherry pick. So I try to think of it as like who, when, where, what, how, and then maybe some miscellaneous. I don't want to ask why questions though. Why is that? Well, because why puts people in the defensive. It kind of makes them feel like, why are you asking me that? Like, I don't really trust you, So you want to kind of rephrase it to not be a why question. So I try to rephrase it more like a why question, like instead of being like, why do we need to build this app? What problem is the app trying to solve, right? And then like, what are you or your users' current pain points? If you can alleviate their pain, even just a little bit, they're going to love you forever. And then some other ones you might want to ask if they're using, certain frameworks or libraries that you'll have to use as well. Because, for example, some of the banks here, they have very strict limitations as to what libraries you can use. A lot of them actually won't let you use even jQuery for front end. You end up having to use vanilla JavaScript. Yep. So you want to clear that up right away. And then kind of figure out, if they have any code standards. Like Airbnb has a code standard documentation. You want to find out if they have that as well. Ask about the brand book. Everybody is really upset about colors. So make sure you get those right. And then, what browsers or operating systems, environments, are you supporting? And then deliverables. This is a biggie, right? That could be just the app itself, but they may also be expecting you to deliver, a pattern library, which is basically saying, okay, I have this common set of UI components like tables, menus, cards, just things of that nature, and they might expect to have those, nicely bundled like HTML templates and CSS properties all together and shipped so they can put it in their other products as well. Documentation, code standards, branding, book, the whole 9 yards. Clear that up right away. And then you'll probably also want to find out, are you expected to do deployments or do they have a DevOps team? That's also a big one. There's been times where it's like, okay, where do I deploy this? Do I just, drag and drop it to the server? Like, hello? Don't do that. I did that. Some other questions you might ask, do we conduct code reviews, pair programming, pull request reviews, like how do we keep the integrity of our code base? And then do we follow any type of Git flow for merging code in? And we'll get into Git flow in a bit if you haven't heard of it. And then two other big ones, especially when working on client projects, would be how are you tracking time and how are you billing? It's all about money. I'm sorry. So let's talk about estimations, because this is a tricky one. Estimating is hard for anybody, honestly, because we don't really know until we are in the thick of the problem. But for green devs especially, because you're not really confident of yourself yet, right? I'm not either. But none of us are, right? So you just got to break it down and kind of figure it out based on a couple of different questions you can ask yourself and then ask your team. First of all, you want to train your thinking away from how much time will this take and more towards how complex is the task. That will guide you towards a time frame. So like what areas of the app could it potentially touch, Is it going to be a risky change? For example, if you're doing just a front end change, like, oh, we just need to change the font color because they hated the color, and versus I need to add or change a column in the database table. That latter one, yeah, that kind of is a little bit risky. Could affect the whole application. So that would be more complex than just changing a color. And then you want to examine, what pieces it will affect and how it works with your existing architecture. So really, are we adding a feature or changing existing architecture because like of a bug or a change in requirements? So then the next one is like, how many people are involved in what departments does it have to go through? This is especially true if your client is a corporation and security is involved or they have any sort of quality assurance or security checking. It also has to do with like, do we need a designer? Do we need a back-end dev, a front-end dev, QA? So many questions to ask, so many people, so little time. You want to meet with those other parties as you identify them and determine how long it'll take them to finish. You don't want to just answer for them, right? They know how long their piece will take. But if it's just you, you're lucky. Look at your skill level and comfort in it, right? And then another question to ask yourself is how much experience do you have into the technology itself, like in the framework or whatever you're doing, or in software development as a whole. It doesn't matter if you don't really have a lot of experience in a framework. If you have enough footing in software development and architecture, then it shouldn't take you too long to pick up the syntax at all. And then you also want to confirm assumptions about your task. This is important because a lot of times with expectations, we don't go into the nitty-gritty details. So some things kind of go through the cracks, right? And we make assumptions about how features should work, and then the product owner makes other assumptions. If they're not communicated, then we have a problem. So anytime you're missing those gaps in requirements, you want to go to your product owner or your client and you want to say, I am making this estimation based on the assumption that X will be the acceptance criteria. Can you confirm? And that will open the door for that conversation. So if you're incorrect, then they can give you the correct acceptance criteria. It also covers your butt. So tackling complicated user stories. I think we've all been there. The first thing I try to do is break down the user story as a whole. So again, we're determining what players are involved in the story. So a new feature will probably need all the points, a designer, front-end dev, back-end dev, the whole 9 yards. An enhancement or a bug fix, say, for example, a new data point that needs to display on the screen may only require 1 or 2 developers. And you want to then evaluate your current architecture, any technical limitations that need clearing first. So again, like security things, maybe API limitations, that type of stuff. Then you're going to assign those points based on complexity, lay the groundwork. So, go ahead and do those tasks in the background, like adding the new column to the database and looping in other sections of the team to give them a heads up, hey, this changed, you need to change your end as well. And then you want to determine singular steps or subtasks and assign them to the parties that is relevant to. and you want to work on one subtask at a time. And how we break down those tasks. So here's an example. You receive that user story and it says, as an admin, I want to be able to log in and see the list of current users. And that's all it says. That can be really overwhelming, even for somebody who's had a lot of experience, because you're just like, I just can't, all these thoughts are in my head and it's just, God, it's just too much. I need to go to the bathroom. So, yeah, what you need to do is just kind of take a deep breath, maybe go to the bathroom, and kind of task it out. First things first, building the login form, on the front end. Add the login route to the app. Add authentication guards to the route, so it will kick the user back if they don't have a bearer token. And then write that authentication service to check for valid token and fetch a refresh token. And from there, do things like HTTP interceptors for your calls to attach that bearer token each call so that the API is then able to return data for that user's role, add that role to the database, all that good stuff. So you're breaking it down and it's more manageable chunks. And we're going to talk about how GetFlow can help you get there. In case you missed it. Terrible, I know. I'm sorry, y'all. Who here has heard of or used GetFlow? Okay, a couple people. Great. So for those of you who aren't as familiar, GetFlow is a methodology. And the idea behind it is to allow for easier tracking of when things are completed and any bug fixes you have. When things go wrong, you can quickly revert it back. And it's also going to allow you to reduce your merge conflicts, right? Because instead of working probably on the same code base at the same time, you're on different branches. And then when you merge it in, you're not going to have somebody overwriting your code. You're going to be able to look at that and review it first before it just goes in and goes, well, there it went to production. Oh no. So using GetFlow will also allow you to break down those user stories into tasks by something called feature branches. The main idea is you have this master branch here, and this represents production, right? And you have your tagged releases for production. You're going to have your release branches, which are for your release candidates. Develop, this is where you're doing all your work on those user stories. And then feature branches. So feature branches are if you get a user story for authentication, you branch it off of develop, do your work, have somebody review that work, and then merge it back into develop. And then from there, once you've done a certain number of features and you say, okay, this sprint is closed, it's time to do a release, you cut the release, and then you have it go through QA. They may come back with bug fixes, you fix those, merge it back in, and then once all is said and done, you go ahead and merge that back into master. Now, if something bad happens in production, you could do a hotfix. So you merge off a master into a hotfix branch. And then once that goes through QA, you'll merge it back into master as well as into develop. So everything's kind of up to date. It's a little tricky to kind of wrap your head around at first, but once you get into a flow of it, you'll say, why did I ever do things any other way? Let's talk about how to unstick yourself when you get a little confused or you say, oh God, this is too much. I'm going to go be a janitor. So some basic unsticking tips. First, we talked about, breaking the task down to manageable chunks. Deep breath, go to the bathroom, come back. It's going to be fine. First, write it in plain English or pseudocode, right? Don't try to, get down in the depths of I'm going to write this Ruby code or, this JavaScript code and all is going to be great. Next thing you know, you've got 20 nested if statements and you're like, where am I? Don't do that. So write it down in plain English first. And then you can make functions out of those statements in English and make sure your functions kind of only do one thing, right? That makes it way more manageable and prevents you from getting lost. Secondly, don't be afraid to ask for help if you get really stuck. So I would say only spend an hour or a couple of hours at most banging your head before you say, okay, I probably need to ask somebody a little bit more senior for help. That's okay. That's what they're there for. So the thing is, just go to them with, what you tried to do and, what you found happened, what you want to do, and say, this is where I'm getting stuck. That way they can better help you. And then research. So if you're maybe like a solo dev on a project or maybe your senior dev is like, hey, go away, in which case they suck and they should be demoted. Then you can go to, of course, Stack Overflow or just, any of the documentation online, any of the communities online. Sometimes you'll see an explanation or a link to specs, which will explain why the problem occurred and how the fix works. And that's important to understand, so that the next time you face this problem, you'll be like, hey, I saw that before. I can fix that, instead of just, oh God, where's the Stack Overflow link so I can just copy paste Franken code, I did that. But the important thing when you're doing this is, first, you want to figure out how to fix it. Get that fix in so you keep the project moving, keep your client from being like, hey, why is it still broken, right? And then you figure out why it works later. A lot of people get hung up on, but why does this work, as they're fixing it? And that really slows them down. If worst comes to worst, it's okay to take a walk or to sleep on it. Just come back to it. Sometimes you're just burnt out. It's okay. So let's go through some scenarios. Yay. Who's been in this problem before? The meeting hot seat. Basically your client comes in asking you what your opinion is about a technical limitation you've never worked with before. You're in the hot seat and everyone in the meeting is looking at you for your expertise. They're like, hey, you're a developer, you know everything, right? Like, you can fix my grandpa's computer, no problem. Well, the first thing, don't panic, don't fall for imposter syndrome. Don't be like, oh God, they're going to find out, they're going to know, I'm going to get fired, right? Because you're not going to get fired, okay? If you don't know, you're not going to get fired. You were hired for a reason. Try to have some confidence in yourself. Developers are hired for their potential and for their ability to solve problems no one has solved before. No one knows what they're doing. None of us. Even if a senior person is going to hit that problem, that they're going to be like, well, I have no idea. Let me ask so-and-so. The main thing that you want to do is to say, you know what, like, I don't know off the top of my head, but I will ask, this person for their opinion, and I'll get back to you in X amount of time. So you want to have like a rough timeline of when you'll have an answer, and give them some sort of action plan to show that you're working on it. That'll satiate them for a while. This one, coding into a corner. We've all done that, right? So in this problem, and this is maybe taken from real experience. You didn't hear that from me though. So your client system doesn't allow for integration with third-party libraries, and you have to use vanilla JavaScript to get the job done. So you've been asked to do a nav bar that has cascading drop-downs. And you've spent 3 days trying to get this thing to work. And it's like, this is going nowhere fast, right? Your tech lead is pinging you on LinkedIn and it's just like, hey, how's it going? Like, I haven't heard from you in a while. You're like, it's great. It's not great, y'all. You need to stop. Don't isolate yourself anymore. It's time to admit you're stuck and ask for help. I know this is going to be a sticky situation. You're going to feel awkward because, you've spent 3 days on it, and oh God, he's going to be so mad, but oh God, I'm going to get fired. It all comes down to I'm going to get fired, right? But no, everybody's been in that situation. We have empathy for each other. The main thing is to own up to the fact that you made a mistake and just be like, I felt like I had a solution almost ready, but I just realized that that's not the case and it's taking me too long. Is there somebody who maybe knows the syntax a little bit better with plain JavaScript that I can pair with, that can help me with the syntax? Like, I know conceptually how to solve the problem, just not syntactically. And that will usually, break through. Even if you're not really sure conceptually, that's okay. Nobody knows everything. That's why we have teams. That's why we have different levels of developers and different types of developers. So let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about being the solo developer. This is both a blessing and a curse, right? A blessing because you can make all the decisions, a curse because you can make all the decisions. So in this case, you're the only developer on your client's project and you're behind schedule due to the workload and the skill gap. The client just called asking about the status. Pesky clients, they always do that, right? He's disappointed to see that you've been working on that same feature for a week. And he really wants to know when his site will be finished. You're really stressed, right? You're like, okay, so we're going to lose the client. No, not necessarily. Basically, what you would probably want to do in a situation is realize, first of all, you're burnt out on the problem. You've been banging your head for a week. You can't be creative about problem solving if you're burnt out. So what you really need to do is raise your confidence in yourself and your abilities. And you can do this by taking on a small, very simple, short task that's in the same sprint and trying to complete that first. Once you find a small success, then you'll feel rejuvenated to be able to tackle the harder problem again without being questioning yourself as a developer and I'm going to just go move to Puerto Rico and just scoop ice cream. It'll be fine. I'm just going to change my name. You don't need to do that. It's okay. If, however, you can't switch tasks, it's not the end of the world. You can try a sounding board. So you can talk to a designer. You can talk to your team lead. You could even talk to a rubber duck. I've done it. You look crazy, but it works. And then you could also whiteboard it out. Sometimes just seeing it written out helps. So let's talk about when things go off the rails. This is when things get scary and real. Okay, what if you're in over your head, right? You bit off more than you could chew. You want to examine the cause and effect to what has happened here. How did you get in over your head? Because this is going to help you solve the problem and kind of swim up to the surface, if you will. There are several things that could cause this to happen. First of all, skill gap, right? So in this case, you want to talk to someone more senior than you or your manager and try to figure out if you should put in extra time at work to make up for that, or if you can study to bridge that gap. Is it realistic? Do you have enough time to do that? You may be assigned a more senior dev to pair with on it, to support you or to train you on things you're missing. But if you are an only developer on the project, you may need to reset expectations around the timeline. Now, it's not always an easy discussion to have, but your client is usually going to be glad that you brought it up now. And I would, if you have a project manager over or somebody kind of leading it, then I would pull him into that as well. The main thing to do when you have a skill gap, you don't want to outright say to the client, hey, guess what? I don't know how to do this. That's going to make them lose a little bit of faith in your company. So you want to try to have faith in yourself like your company had in you. The main way we try to phrase it, at least at Cardinal, is more along the lines of, hey, upon further investigation, we feel like there were some technical limitations we missed, and we're sorry that we missed it. We feel like we need this much more time, and we need to push back the delivery date to this. As long as you give them, a light at the end of the tunnel, they're usually more empathetic, right? Than just being like, hey, I don't know how long it's going to take. Could be a day, could be a month, So then the second one is technical limitations, right? And those usually can't be circumvented. That might be things like access to an account or through security, firewalls, things of that nature. And that you're just going to have to work with the appropriate people to get through. And then too many features and not enough time. Something went wrong in estimating, and we need to go back to resetting expectations. So let's talk about what to do if you miscalculate your estimations. Know and accept that this will happen even if you're a senior developer. It's happened to me a lot. First of all, take a step back, evaluate the situation. How much damage was really done by your misestimation, right? Where did the estimate go wrong? Then you want to evaluate your relationship with your team and your client before you determine how you're going to fix this. How was the trust level looking before this happened? Was it already low? Was it high and this is the first time it happened? If it was high already and you have a little bit more leeway, but if it was low already, then you're going to have to do some serious damage control. And then it's important, really, don't place the blame on others. It doesn't matter if the client didn't get you the information that you needed in time. It doesn't matter if so-and-so teammate didn't finish the design or didn't do this or that. You've got to remember, as a part of the team, it's going to be a bad reflection on the team to throw somebody else under the bus. So it's important to just say, okay, hey, this happened, and we're sorry that it didn't, get done on time, and we misestimated, and then go back to resetting those expectations. And finally, own up to mistakes. So if you did make a mistake, first apologize for skewing the timeline, admit that miscommunication or blockers that you had, and kind of explain where it went wrong. and then determine your action to correct and get that project back on schedule. That could be anything from, just maybe shifting priorities around in the sprint, pulling some things out of the sprint, or, working late, or just saying, hey, we're just going to be later than we thought. And it depends on your client. And then you want to communicate that you understand what went wrong and your action plans for preventing that from going wrong in the future. So what if you bloated project scope, right? This happens a lot, especially when you've got a frantic client emailing you directly, like bypassing the project manager and emailing you directly saying, hey, I really need this done. I have this customer coming in and he really was expecting this. And you're just like, that came out of the blue. Well, don't panic because your client is panicking, and don't head down implement it, right? Never do any work that was not signed off by the client and the project manager. You're going to have a couple people sign off on that work first. The reason for this is you're not only skewing the timeline, you're potentially costing your client money and they don't realize it. They might think it's part of what they've paid for, but it's not. So you always want to go back to your contract, to your statement of work, and make sure that it's in there. And talk to your project manager. If you've already started work on it before you caught yourself, then you need to do a couple of things for damage control. First, you need to tell your project manager or your team lead immediately and work with them to readjust that timeline. Doing things like shifting priorities around, pulling things out of the sprint, that type of thing. And before you do any of that, you're going to want to take that action plan for here's what we can do to fix it. And you need to talk to your client. And you put the reins in their hands. You need to give the client control and make them feel like they have say. If they've asked for this feature and it's more important, then we need written sign off on that and say, okay, we originally said these features, but then you came here on this date and said this feature was more important. So that way, again, your butt is covered. And your client can't get mad at you. But there's some clients that still will. That brings us to this next point. What if your client is angry? Oh God, this is the scariest situation to be in, right? We've all been there though. It happens. It can feel like a lot is at stake here too, right? Again, you're thinking, oh God, I'm going to lose my job. We're going to lose the client. The company's going to lose money. It's all my fault. Stop. It's not always your fault. Sometimes no matter what we do to please the client, they're just going to be mad. There's just some people like that, and you're just going to have to accept that. Some ways to kind of fix this. First of all, empathize with your client's frustration, even if you don't feel like it. You're just going to have to communicate, even if you just want to run 10,000 miles away. Just throw your computer in a lake. Just talk to your client. Say, it makes me feel X, that Y happened. You don't want to be like, well, no. Try to use I feel that statements. I want to help you achieve Z. So let's discuss how we can fix this, right? So you're aligning yourselves to that common goal by saying, hey, we're on the same page here. We're on the same team. We both want the same things. And that can make them feel a little bit softer, more open to you, because we both want the product to succeed. And then again, it goes all the way back to resetting your expectations and kicking off the project again if you need to. I have an example of this actually. So it wasn't too terribly long ago. I inherited a project from another team. And the client was already angry because some things had been miscommunicated. There had been some mismanagement. It wasn't really anybody's fault, more just the key players weren't there, right? So it had to do with lack of experience, had to do with lack of resources. What I realized coming on board was these clients don't trust the development team. We can't be the ones to talk to them about resetting the expectations and moving this project forward. So I managed to get a project manager in, and I said, okay, they're going to think the development team is biased, and they're going to say, if we say, oh, we can't do that, they're going to think it's because we don't want to, because we're lazy, because that was how bad the relationship was. We said, okay, if you say it, you're like a third party, you're seen as more neutral, then they'll trust you. So we reset that trust with the new person. We rebuilt the relationship from the ground up, reset the expectations and timeline, kicked the project off again, and now the clients are happy and they trust us completely with any projects they have or changes they have. So things, even when they seem like they can't be salvaged, there is a way. It's just gonna be really uncomfortable. So at that point, you want to build a plan for action for phase 2 of your project. And then you want to communicate clearly and frequently. So set touch points with your client. So every day, like if you're doing Agile, or every couple of days, just whatever they're comfortable with, to show progress and ask questions so the project stays on target. And that makes them feel warm and fuzzy inside. Just never leave them hanging. So what happens if the client doesn't follow the typical dev cycle that we showed in the beginning? For example, no design phase. That's a problem, because what are you building, right? Like, you don't really know. If there happens to be a designer anywhere in your department, it's totally okay to sit down with them and say, here's my problem. I'm not really sure how to solve it. Can we do a quick whiteboarding session, a quick prototyping session, just so I have something to go off of? And just ask questions about placement or expected flow or interaction as tasks are assigned to you. And that'll get you started. Otherwise, if there's no designer, if it's just you, you're going to have to dev design. Yeah, that's fun. So whiteboard it out with your client, and that way your client can see it and say, okay, like, I like this, I don't like this. They like to be involved in the process. Give them control. That's the key. And then you want to run that whiteboard or paper prototype by your coworkers to do some, A/B testing. So how would you use this app presented with this flow? Does this make sense? What do you like or not like about it? That type of thing. Like, how would you accomplish your goal? If you don't have a QA phase, that's concerning, but it happens a lot. It's okay. We can mitigate that by following Git flow to release features. We can write unit and end-to-end tests ourselves. And then you can manually test that in multiple browsers for front end, and then through Postman for like API calls. And you want to try to get multiple people doing it at the same time, because people are going to use the product in different ways. If they can break it, they will. User will find a way to break it. And then you get the product owner to validate the work in a sandbox environment before you push it to production. Let's say now that there's no lead developer. You're the lead developer. Oh God, that's scary. But it's okay. This is an opportunity for you. You can own this. It can really ramp up your experience, though it's very unsettling at first. So you could do things like write out logic flow and pseudocode first. Use ERDs for backend architecture to ensure it makes sense. Do your diagrams to show how the tables will relate to each other before you just start doing your SQL queries. And take small steps and refactor as you go along. Again, done is better than good. If there are any other developers around, like peers of yours, ask them to review your code before you merge it in. So now, worst case scenario, you lost the client. Oh God, it's bleeding. Well, it's going to feel like the end of the world. It always does. You're going to feel terrible. But you just go through those stages of grief. You're going to eventually get to acceptance. It's going to happen sometimes, no matter how much we have tried to make the client happy, how much we've tried to salvage the situation. And again, it doesn't mean you're going to get fired. The only way you're going to get fired is if you did it intentionally and you're just like, hey, screw you, client, or you were just unprofessional. That's the only way that you would be in danger of getting fired. So a couple things you can do to make sure this doesn't happen again. Discuss with your team what went wrong during the project. So more like a project retrospective, right? Determine next steps with your team to ensure it doesn't happen again. How can we prevent, the code base from having so many merge conflicts and then just going out to production, destroy the client's website. No. You're going to want to put checks in place. And then know when to let it go. So let's say it wasn't really something you did wrong. If the client was being unreasonable, then you just have to be like, hey, that client was a bad client. I wish I had fired him first. So learn to pick the warning signs for bad clients, and this is especially if you're a freelancer. For example, obviously if the client is like yelling at you from the get-go or being like, hey, I went through like 5 other developers, they didn't know what they were doing, I'm so glad I found you though. That's a red flag, but it's usually more subtle than that, right? Like adding features after MVP was agreed upon, you signed the contract, you signed statement of work, everything is in writing. Or if they run the project over time and over budget, they keep squeezing things in, scope creeping, just creeping, not good. Pushing for items not listed in the statement of work contract. So saying, you had the MVP written down, and then they say, hey, I need you to build this set of APIs for this other app. no, you didn't sign off on that. Don't do the work. Always go back to that statement of work or your contract and make sure that your butt is covered. And then any unreasonable expectations. So I've had clients, ask me for it to be completed in 2 or 3 weeks, and it's like a complicated app, and I'm like, there's no way, like we need that time just for testing, or just asking for significant pricing cuts. Like, oh hey, like I expected this to be done in 3 weeks and it's not. Can you just like cut me a deal? No, just no. Let it go, let it go. So the bottom line of every part of making your project succeed is communication is key, so always keep your project manager or team lead in the loop. Keep contact with the client. Again, don't leave them hanging. Communicate blockers as soon as they come up. Sometimes like you might feel tempted to wait until stand up the next morning. No, don't even do that. Go to your scrum master or your team lead and be like, hey, I need this. That's why we go to work in person. You don't want to wait for it to get worse. So be honest, never BS through problems. Say you don't know when you don't, but you will find out, because that's why we're hired, to find out things that nobody knows how to solve. Don't spin your wheels. Ask for help if you need it. And don't be afraid to ask as many questions as you need. It doesn't matter if so-and-so gets irritated. Who cares? This isn't about their personal space. This isn't happy, fun, like introvert time. This is time to get the project done. That's why we go to work. That's why we're paid. They're getting paid to answer your questions, dang it. So ask them for advice. And then reset expectations and communication failures as problems arise. Communicate your assumptions, like we talked about before. And above all, listen more than you speak. It will be very much appreciated. Your client will have more trust in you, as they will see you as somebody trustworthy and as a friend, as a confidant, if you will. So this will all make you better than about 95% of other developers, I would say. So I've worked with a lot of crappy developers. They don't communicate. Sucks. So let's have like maybe 5 minutes of Q&A. You might have questions. No question. Yes.
So you start to see a pattern for some of these problems from certain like project managers and account leads. How do you start to, educate them to alleviate some of those, even if you've gone through some of these, like this project had this problem, this project had this problem. Are there higher level concepts to try to, get, because of course most of the project managers are not going to understand Scrum or Agile, and most of them aren't going to understand the little minute challenges that we face.
I think the core thing is just to make sure they understand, we need to interface with the client, and we need to say when things are starting to kind of slip off the rails. Those are really like the 2 core things that will solve most of your problems, right? I haven't really had a problem with project managers in the past, actually. I've been at I think 9 companies. And most of the project managers I know are pretty organized and pretty put together. Most often than not, their problem comes with anger management. So, yeah. So at that point, you just need to be like, okay, I'm sorry. I understand you're angry. I understand why you're angry. I feel your frustration. I'm frustrated too. As long as you can empathize with that, be like, yeah, I'm frustrated too. Let's just vent this out. If you can, reset the stage and be like, we're on the same team, then they'll calm down, and then you can talk like sane people. Yeah, most of the time they will understand if you come to them with a problem. Be like, so, I've noticed this tends to happen. Is there any way that we can, as a team, you always want to say we have the problem, not like, hey, you are doing this thing. We are doing this thing, so, yeah. Yes.
What recommendations would you have for people that are say doing their own personal projects and kind of, striving towards this kind of position? Obviously, you can think of setting your own expectations and whatnot, but what advice would you have for kind of emulating these good practices within our own projects?
Right, that can be more difficult if you're working on internal projects or your own projects, because this is something that kind of takes practice, right? I do have a couple resources at the end that may help you. They have something called Crucial Conversations, which is a book that we as consultants at Cardinal are, kind of expected to read as a part of our training. And it's got a lot of good like training material for, dealing with these sticky conversations. It's more broad-based, but it'll help you on projects as well. I believe they also have more formalized training that goes around. I'll have to confirm on that, but I think doing things like that, or going to meetups, maybe being more involved in, like Toastmasters type things, or getting involved in things like Code for Charlotte, things like that, where you can work on a larger team, or even, night shift, Skookum's night shift. If you can just get involved with a group of people working as a team, then you'll have a chance to practice this without potentially jeopardizing anything. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Will this information be somewhere that we can have access to it?
Yeah.
It is really great information.
Yeah, I'll be posting it online. Were you taping it, or?
Yeah, I'm also recording it, so I'm starting a YouTube channel for meetups that I'll go to and tape myself. So
Yeah. So
I
you can
can give you guys a link and maybe put it in the comments of the meetup.
listen to my squeaky voice again and again.
Make sure it gets in the Slack channel somehow. Someone will put it there.
Yeah, I'll get it from you.
Okay,
and we
cool.
can share it with whoever you guys want to review it later on.
I have a random personal
Yes.
question. Is that VS Code?
What?
Is that VS Code you have down there?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yes, it is.
Not props.
How many
I'll
windows
second
is
that.
that?
Huh?
How many
How many
windows is
different
that?
windows is that?
You should see my browser on the tab clean.
I have a tab problem.
I just learned today that there is an extension called Toby that helps you manage if you have too many tabs. You can take a series of tabs and save them and then reopen them later.
Nice.
Dangerous though, because then they just get forgotten about.
Yeah, I used to use a thing called
Then you-
One Tab, and I have like 21 tabs.
You're like,
and I've
what?
never- It's just- it's really good.
I started doing this thing where I have like new windows that have a series of tabs and then they're all related to a specific thing.
Yep.
That's like
Yeah.
my main
Okay.
strategy.
If I can't see the icons anymore,
Yeah.
It's like object impermanence, right? Like a baby, like, oh, it's gone.
Yeah. Never mutates things.
Yeah. All right, any other questions?
So, I guess this is a nebulous one. So, you kind of mentioned that you talk more than once that it's your last slide pretty much. Communication is key, right? So, and you kind of implied at the very beginning that, I don't know if this is true. You can tell me or not. But you kind of seemed to imply that you dove into coding because you were trying to not talk to people. So, with that in mind, what helped you to get to the point that you could actually deal with crazy people that have all sorts of crazy
Oh, yeah.
expectations, right?
Right, let me tell you what happened. So I had very, very terrible social anxiety, and here I am today. So what happened was I got hit by so many terrible clients and so many terrible, experiences that I just grew numb to it. You just get jaded and numb. But on a more positive point of view, with the experience, you will feel better about those situations. And you will feel better about communicating with people. I think actually the turning point for me, in addition to speaking at meetups, that really helped me come out of my comfort zone a lot, and I would recommend it. I think it was actually crucial conversations, because it changed the way that I communicated with myself internally. I kind of had all this negative self-talk and, imposter syndrome, and then, reading that book, it sounds really cheesy, but it changed my life because it changed the way I talk to myself. Any other questions?
I have one. Trying to think of how to phrase this. So obviously, since we live in Charlotte, there's going to be a bunch of banks, and with a lot of the bank jobs, you're going to be thrown into an environment maybe where you've never used a stack, that you've heard of it, but you're like, I don't really care about this. I'm going to use Vue. I'm going to use whatever else. But you're like, oh wait, no, we're going to send you off into this. So you're using something you're completely uncomfortable with, you've never used before, and like you're saying, you're dealing with a lot of your talking to dealing with clients and like a scope of a project or whatnot. But maybe in that scenario, you don't deal with that absolutely at all. You're just thrown into this monolithic program of whatever feature they're trying to use or whatever they're trying to do. What's the best way if, you know, a developer has just like landed a job where you have to do something like that to kind of go about it without thinking that this is like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
Right. Oh, I see what you're saying. Like, you know, you have one expertise, and
You
then
get thrown into something where it's like,
you're
it's just
completely out of the water.
overwhelming, like, way
Gotcha.
overwhelming, yeah.
Gotcha. So what I realized that I needed to do to fix those situations was to go back to the basics. I was kind of backwards. I learned JavaScript by learning Angular first, and that was probably not the best tactic. But I went back and I learned plain JavaScript. I read everything I could find. I read the O'Reilly book, JavaScript Patterns. I read JavaScript, The Good Parts, you know, bits and pieces of, I think it was like the JavaScript Ninja. Those 3 books, you know, are really core to JavaScript, at least for ES5. Then ES6 came out, and, you know, there's a lot of documentation online. So I spent a lot of time going through that, going through Wes Boss's courses for ES6, for the JavaScript 30-day challenge, that type of thing. And I spent a lot of time on my own, brushing up on the basics. And I got a good core foundation in the basics, so that now, whenever I'm in that situation, they say, hey, we're using this framework. I'm like, cool, I know how JavaScript works. Like, the syntax might be a little scary at first, but I'm going to be okay because I know what it maps to. And sometimes I get really nerdy, and I go into the source code, and I'm like, how did they do this? and I even, at one point, tried to backwards engineer Angular to understand it better. So I just do little bits and pieces of that just to get like a basic understanding of how people build frameworks, so that then when I'm thrown into a new situation, it's not so scary.
And what about if that framework tries to not use like barely any JavaScript? I'm currently working with Ember, and yeah, sorry, yes, and I'm having a tough time. Like, I mean, I picked up frameworks throughout like my career, and it's been, you know, decent.
Right.
With Ember, it's like, no. It's like, you're not writing JavaScript, you're writing whatever Ember wants you to write.
I think I know where you work.
Yeah. So it's something like that where it's completely different from everything. If you ever have to get thrown into that situation, what do you think is the best approach to go about it?
Well, again, like knowing the way that software development works, and I feel confident in the architecture perspective, but from a syntax perspective, it could be, you know, pretty scary. So I try to research online. I try to look at, you know, if you're working on a team, which I assume you are, because I think I know where you work. I would look at, you know, their code for like a base example of how they do things stylistically. And that's like a good starting point, is just reading the current code base to try to figure it out. Ask them if they have any specific code standards. They might be a little bit kind of frigid, but if you joke with them enough, they'll warm up. Yeah, from personal experience. Yeah. Any other questions? No.
All right, thanks for coming out,
Well,
Sarah.
yeah, thank you. I have some resources. These are ones that Cardinal recommends and that some of our consultants use. I will be sending those out. Those have the links to, you know, whatever. That last one is a Pluralsight course. You can have a free trial to go through it. And then if you want to pick my brain, you know, you have a sticky problem, you need a mentor, buy me coffee. I'll chat. All right, thank you.